Is there a picture on the screen? That lovely young lady, I miss her. Her name is Brooke Bess, and she lives in Columbia, South Carolina. And my daughter Brianna and I got to know her while I was in seminary. She graduated from college last year. Anyway, I was flipping through Facebook, because you know we can always find gospel lessons in Facebook. And she posted a story that was a perfect illustration for our lesson today. What she had said was that she had gone to a store and that there was a young guy there whose car wouldn't start. The battery needed a jump. And so Brooke asked the man if she could help him. He had a very shocked look on his face, but he agreed. After his car was up and running, he thanked her, she said, about 1,000 times, and then asked if he could take a picture of them together. This is what Brooke says. Confused, I said, yeah, but why? He replied, it's not every day that a young white lady would help a black guy like me. My saggy pants, gold grill, which means teeth, and gold chain didn't scare you away. I simply replied, I'm sorry society and the media has made strangers like ourselves enemies. But not every black man is a thug and not every white person is a racist. Now, get over here on my good side and hold the phone at an angle so you don't get my double chin. A black man with saggy pants, gold teeth, gold chain around his neck. I wonder how many of us would have done like Brooke and asked this man or offered to give this man our help. Or I wonder how many of us might have had the courage to help this man had he asked us. My hunch is, though, that this man would not have asked Brooke to help him because, like he said, women like her don't help men like him every day. And that's really sad, isn't it? That somebody really needs help and will not reach out and ask for it, and the fundamental reason that they don't is because of fear. He may have feared rejection by Brooke, that's true, but there may have been a deeper fear because the reality is in South Carolina, there are areas where if a black man reaches out to a white woman for any reason, there might be some radical white folk that might want to have something to say or do about it. Thankfully, Brooke is a young lady who is not only friendly and gregarious, she's also a compassionate and a helpful person that knows that everybody is a child of God. But it goes a little further than that, because for Brooke to offer to help this man took a risk. I mean, it's a risk when we offer to help any stranger, right? But like I said, in South Carolina, there are places that people, had she offered to help a man, a black man, there are people who would have thought things or said things or maybe would have done things in response. But Brooke is wiser than her 30 years. She said something I thought was very, very, very powerful, that society and that the media help to make strangers into enemies. Strangers into enemies. Now, I believe in the bottom of my heart that everybody here is friendly and caring and compassionate and helpful. But if we go back to the question that I asked earlier, I'm guessing that there are a lot of us who would think twice about offering to help that man at the store. And if we strip it all down and take everything away, the reason we might second guess is because of fear. And sure, we need to think about what we do, right? We don't want to put ourselves in danger unless God calls us to do that. And there are all kinds of reasons and traditions and stories that inform our fear. And this is especially true when there's stories that we hear about people and situations that are totally foreign to us. When we don't personally know someone whose culture or background or experiences are different than ours, then it's easy to believe what we hear about them. And it's easy to perpetuate that fear by repeating what we hear. And it isn't right to base our decisions on those traditions and those stories because they may not be based in truth. The right thing to do is to learn the facts, but it's also important that we discern what the Spirit is doing and what the Spirit is saying in that situation. God created a diverse people, a diverse animal kingdom, a diverse geography and ecology. Everything God has created is diverse. And since we're called to love all people and all of God's creations, one of the struggles in living faithfully is figuring out how to do that. Well, in Acts, the Spirit shows us how, through its work in the apostles and all the disciples that were with him. First, context is important. Remember that right before this, the disciples were locked in the house for fear of the Jews. They were afraid that they might suffer and die like Jesus did. It was fear that paralyzed them. It was fear that held them hostage in that house. But then the resurrected Jesus comes by for a visit and says, who knows? Shalom, y'all. Right? Peace be with you. Then he opened their mind to scriptures and told them to stay in Jerusalem so that they might be empowered from on high. Now, if I were one of those disciples, not knowing what I know today, I can imagine what my response to Jesus would be. What? You want us to stay here in Jerusalem where all of your enemies are, where all of our enemies are? We're afraid. Are you crazy? Most of us have heard Philippians 4:7. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Evidently, the disciples did receive that peace. Peace was their pre-Pentecostal experience. You see, they have to first receive peace before they could do anything, right? I mean, if we're not at peace, how can we serve God? How can we be disciples? How can we make good decisions if we're fearful? So, after the disciples received the peace, Jesus gave them the wisdom and the courage to go to the temple in Jerusalem. The temple, a place where all the Jews were gathered, many of whom wanted them dead. But they went back to Jerusalem, and they went to the temple, and they worshiped God, and the Spirit came out of nowhere and blew away the temple traditions. It was all interrupted. There was confusion. There was doubt. There was joy. There was accusations that they were drunk. That's how rumors get started. And stories were told in many languages, but these stories were true. These were stories of the good things that God had done. Some of us, like the disciples locked in the house, have pre-Pentecostal stories. There have been times when we've been fearful or anxious or worried, and then when we take it to God in prayer, suddenly there's peace. I was visiting two of our shut-ins this week, Lee and Ardell Mack, and they each gave me a pre-Pentecostal, and I guess I'll call it a full Pentecostal story. A long time ago, somebody really hurt Ardell, and she was laying in bed one night just thinking about it and just afraid and sad and just all kinds of things, when suddenly these words kept going through her mind. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And she said those words again over and over in her head, and she knew that God was telling her that unless she forgave this person, she would have no peace. Well, she didn't forgive this person face to face, and that's okay, but she did forgive them in her heart. And at that point, she was able to let go of her fear, and she was able to let go of the pain. And she did have peace. That's her pre-Pentecostal story. Now, I wonder how different Ardell's life might have been had she not forgiven that person. I think that perhaps if the Spirit had not given her the wisdom what to do and the strength to do it, I may not be able to share this next story with you. You see, many of you may not know this, but Ardell spent a career managing and developing nursing homes. These nursing homes were high quality. The residents were treated with love and compassion. She also started a knitting ministry, which many of you know, knitting hats for the homeless. And that's been going on for generations now, and some of you actually participate in that ministry now. Now, if the Spirit had not helped Ardell to let go of her fear and her pain, she may never have been able to seek out the elderly and to seek out the homeless and find out what they needed, to learn about them and what they really truly needed. And that's what she needed to know so that she might serve them rightly. You see, these people, the residents, the homeless that receive the hats, these people are part of that full Pentecostal story. They experience for themselves the good things that God was doing through Ardell. Most of us know her husband Lee, too, how much of a jokester he is, but also how faithful and compassionate he is. Lee told me that there were many times in his life when it seemed like there were just so many different things going on at the same time, and he was unable to control them, and it created fear. It created fear because he couldn't control them, and it created fear because he didn't know what was going to happen. He didn't know how all these things were going to turn out. But he said there was like a quiet, still inner voice that said to him, "Don't worry, it will all work out." And the reality is things did work out. And he had peace. That's his pre-Pentecostal story. But again, I wonder what would have happened had Lee allowed the fear his whole life to cause him to jump in and try to fix everything all the time. Had the Spirit not given him the wisdom and the courage to let go of the situations that he had no control over and to give them to God and to let God work it out. Lee always made sure that homeless people had something very important. I don't know how many of you know this, but Lee actually visited homeless communities, and they had all kinds of canned food, but they had no can openers. They had the food, but they didn't have access to it. And you know Lee, he's a retired military man. What a P-something. What are those little... P-38. P-38. He bought every P-38 in Springfield, Missouri, and went back to these communities and delivered them to these homeless communities so that they could open up these cans of food. Another thing that's a little more recent that many of you here know about is that tool sale, right? There were a lot of garages in town that had lots of expensive tools, people who like to work with wood and carpentry. A lot of widows had all these tools in their garages and no sons that wanted them. So what Lee did was help to coordinate with the men's group here and with a Methodist church and with a Missouri Synod church, and gathered all these wonderful tools together and had a tool sale. So all the garages were empty, they all came here. People who wanted those kind of tools, that may not have been able to afford them otherwise, were able to purchase them, and then they raised, what was it, over $7,000, right, for least of these. My goodness, empty garages, people with good tools, and $7,000 to least of these. That is a full Pentecostal story. It was because of the Spirit's help that Lee was able to spend his energy and time not worrying about what he could not do and what he could not control, but instead do the things that he could. I was talking to Brandon and Angie Messner the other day, and they both told me, and maybe it's because they're very young, okay? Maybe it's because they're young. But what they said was that it seems that they never really reached a point of fear in their lives, because they already know that things are going to work out, and they rest in that. And isn't that a beautiful thing, this calm and this peace in all circumstances? This is the fruit of trust and faith in God, in God's presence with us in the Spirit. Now let's go back to Acts for a minute and imagine the context because it's important. It's kind of like the Olympics were going on in Jerusalem. But instead of athletes all coming together from around the world to share their athletic gifts, people all gathered into Jerusalem to celebrate the harvest, the first fruits of their labor. And it was within that context that the Spirit empowered enough people to speak enough language to tell of all the good things that God had done to a very diverse group of people. And if you think about it, we're living in that kind of context today. Because of faith, we're gathered here in a temple of sorts. And we are ethnically diverse. Okay, we may not be black and white and yellow, but some of us are Norwegian, some of us are Swedish, or Dutch, or German, or English, or Jewish, or Latvian, or Portuguese. And there are thousands of people in our community who share our ethnicity, and many more who come from other cultures that we don't know about. I think it's important that we learn about them. Some of us come here for the simple purpose of worshiping God or giving God our first fruits. Some of us gather here because we are a community of faith and we truly want to love and care for one another. And that's wonderful. All of those things are wonderful. Some of us gather here to learn more about God and how God might be active in our lives. And that's all great too. But there are people in our community who really don't know what it's like to worship God, who really don't know what it's like to give God first fruits, or what it's like to truly love and care for one another, because they've never had anyone show them how. And there are a lot of churches who really don't want someone like them in their community. So God, help us understand how important it is for us to accept them and love them and teach the way. Some of us are frightened. We don't know what the doctor is going to say next. We don't know what our loved one will do next. We don't know how to stop church decline. We don't know how we're going to pay the bills. Yeah, there's a lot of fear. But remember, there is always good news. The Spirit is with us always, even when, or maybe I should say, especially when we're frightened. Peace be with you. The Spirit will always give us the wisdom to know what to do and the courage to do it. Let us pray. Good and most gracious God, help us to face our fears. Help us to face the unknown. Keep us from perpetuating the